to Israel Unpacked. We're here today with Sarit Michaeli. She's the spokesperson of B'tselem. B'tselem is an Israeli human rights organization, and we'll have Sarit explain to us about this organization and what they do. So tell us about B'tselem.
B'tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, is an Israeli primarily research and information organization that is focused on exposing, on publicizing, on researching.
It's a non-governmental organization, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And effectively, we're self-appointed critics of our government's policy in the occupied territories.
Within just the occupied territories?
Right. The B'tselem's mandate is geographical in the sense that we deal only with the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and of course with related human rights violations that occur inside Israel. So of course the most clear one is Palestinian attacks on Israeli civilians within Israel.
So you document those cases as well?
Yes. The vast majority of the work we do looks at Israeli violations of the rights of Palestinians. Mm-hmm. Of course, we look at the Israeli authorities, not at individual Israelis.
Right. Okay, let's take the last conflict, Operation Protective Edge. You have published a report, I think it was called Black Flag, if I'm not mistaken, regarding that operation. Can you take us through how you went about documenting, using that as an example, mm-hmm. Human rights violations that were carried out in that respect?
So the model that B'tselem employs is very much a field model, in the sense that the information that we get originates from the field, from witness testimonies and from other evidence and information that is gathered from the field, yeah. And is then, goes through a very rigorous process of analysis, verification in the office that includes both a factual analysis and also a legal analysis. This has been the way we've operated, probably since the organization was established in 1989, and it's quite a common method for human rights organizations to work through. You're basing your research on witness statements, on testimonies taken from victims or witnesses to human rights violations, and then you use that information as the basis for your work.
And are those testimonies taken during the conflict itself?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, effectively we employ a kind of a mixed model when it comes to Gaza. The work we do in Gaza is different, is unique in the sense that Israelis from our staff in Israel are prohibited from entering Gaza. We've been prohibited from entering Gaza since 2007. So we rely on Gaza field. Well,
okay.
We have our own field workers in Gaza, but they go through a very rigorous process of work, study, training to understand the organization and the work. What they do is to bring information and bring research from the field, from Palestinian witnesses and from other sources within Palestinian society in Gaza. This information on the whole is transmitted to us at the office, where Israeli and Palestinian workers of B'tselem will go over this information, which will then of course serve as the foundation for our reports. The research department will look at this information, but also at many other sources. So, of course, official Israeli-Palestinian sources, media reports, and, a whole myriad of other sources.
So this leads me into my next question. And I guess the reason why you cross-check the information is because you want to make sure it's verified, that it's accurate. To what extent can you make sure that these people on the ground gathering information are not being fed by falsified information? You said that some of the information is from the actual official bodies in Gaza. The official bodies are mainly Hamas. Somebody somewhere might want to paint a certain picture. What did you do with it?
So, basically what you've described isn't a new feature. Mm-hmm. It's, of course, intensified with the Hamas takeover of Gaza, in the sense that they have a lot of control, not absolute but very extreme control over who does what within Gaza. But it's been a feature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the start. So information, the veracity of information, the truthfulness, the factual accuracy of information has always been a matter of dispute between Israel and the Palestinians. And in fact, one of the reasons B'tselem was founded in the first place, in the kind of the height of the first Intifada, was because there was a realization that there's an urgent need for truthful, accurate information that will not kind of be part of this game, I shouldn't call it a game, it's a struggle between Israel and Palestine.
So I appreciate the fact that you go out your way to make sure that whatever you do publish has been verified by yourselves to the best of your ability. I understand and I appreciate that. But going back to the Black Flag report, something that caught my eye in that report refers to the issue of prior warning to civilians before a strike was taken in the area in which they live. I think it was claimed in that report that the prior warning that was given was either ineffective or absent. I think that was the wording that was used. On the other hand, during the days of the conflict, I saw a report by I think it was a British journalist who actually described the Israeli efforts by the IDF to pre-warn civilians as being unprecedented in history, in war history thus far. In other words, never before have civilians been receiving flyers, phone calls, text messages, and the infamous or famous knock-on-roof method. In Kosovo, hardly any notification was given at all. In Libya, all they used was leaflets and radio broadcasts, and this isn't very, very long ago, and this is operations carried out by NATO. Yet the IDF has gone much further in notifying civilians. So how do you balance?
What's our analysis?
Yeah.
Well, I have to first clarify that I'm not an expert in any of these other conflicts, and B'tselem very, blatantly does not do comparative research.
But you don't think that it's for perspective's sake and for a more insightful and accurate picture's sake that such a comparison is important? At least not one that should be published, but at least in your internal sort of...
You could do many other comparisons. That's not our methodology. Okay. Our methodology looks at the actions of our government and compares them to the declared statements. When you look at the cases that we investigated, 70 cases where more than 3 members of the same family were killed when their house was bombed. Most of the people, and obviously, it kind of stands to reason, the reason people were killed in these attacks was because they didn't receive a warning.
Right.
Or they received a warning in a way that they couldn't understand, because it was unclear at the time that there's going to be a bombing. That's exactly the difference between a warning and an effective warning. If you throw leaflets in an open area that houses hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, you have to also answer to the need for those people to have a way to leave their homes, to have safe places to go to. An additional issue is, of course, that you can't then treat the areas where you issue these warnings as sterile areas. Everyone knows, and we've been giving this information in real time as well, that not all of the Palestinians living in these areas evacuated. In some cases they couldn't, for whatever reason. They didn't have the capacity to leave, they were afraid of leaving, or for whatever reason.
Some cases they were told not to leave. At least some of the claims from the Israeli side are that Hamas has actually specifically asked them not to leave and ignore those warnings.
We certainly heard these kinds of statements by the official Israeli spokespeople saying that Palestinians were warned not to leave. If there's evidence of that, certainly it's absolutely outrageous and a legal violation in and of itself by Hamas or other armed groups members. It's intimidation. It's a it's a violation of international humanitarian law to force civilians to stay in a dangerous area. So that, and of course it's not.
But have you come across such testimonies in your research?
Most people that we spoke to said that the reason they decided to stay was fear of leaving. The worry that they'll be, that they'll go someplace which will then also be bombed, because it wasn't clear, like over the summer, it wasn't as if the airstrikes concentrated on specific areas. And the other issue was the conditions in these centers. However, as I said, it's not the first, Palestinian armed groups, primarily, of course, Hamas's military wing, but other armed groups as well, have violated international law in a whole range of, ways during the summer. Obviously, shooting at Israeli civilians, operating from within densely populated Palestinian areas. Specifically, the issue of, forcing Palestinian civilians to stay at home. I haven't seen that much evidence.
There's actually a footage of a Hamas spokesman that I've seen asking civilians to stay, to ignore the Israeli warnings and stay.
That's one thing. Obviously, that's unacceptable. But I mean specific. I'm talking more about individual cases where militants would prohibit Palestinians from leaving.
Sure. Do these all things make their way to your reports as well?
You should, of course, they exist in our report. But again, I just want to clarify. It's very important to remember that the one side's violations don't justify a violation on the other side. Maybe one other issue about the warnings themselves.
Yes.
There was a recent, very fascinating, actually, interview with member of Knesset Ofer Shelach in Haaretz. He was involved in many of these discussions in the Knesset's committee, the Knesset's security committee on Operation Protective Edge, and generally he's quite knowledgeable and has a lot of inside information. And I think he described it quite well, in the sense that he described all of the efforts that went into giving all of these prior warnings. If in spite of all of this enormous effort, you still have such a large number of fatalities who weren't targeted, certainly weren't targeted officially by the authorities, then the policy itself needs to be re-examined and looked at, especially when it seems like, and as I said, the reason I'm mentioning the Ofer Shelach interview is because he clearly states there that many of the targets, many of the objectives for these attacks were the family homes of armed group operatives, Hamas commanders, etc. Even if there is some activity, there has to be a specific contribution to Hamas's military campaign in order for those homes to be considered legitimate military targets. But regardless of that, if Ofer Shelach states that they're mostly the homes of commanders in Hamas, this makes it even more imperative that the Israeli authorities, the Israeli security forces, look at this policy and try to look at it, because unfortunately, and the horror is that if the situation in Gaza continues as it is, there are the same issues that plague Gaza and its relationship with Israel continue. The terrible reality is that we might be facing another military conflict.
Sure. I think that's a fair assumption.
Which is horrific, of course, because the thought of Israelis and Palestinians spending another summer in this terrible conflict, such a large number of Israeli soldiers was killed in this conflict, and of course the terrible toll on Palestinians. If this is going to repeat itself, then we need to figure out ways to make the authorities change certain decisions that were taken about the choice of targets, about the choice of weapons, etc.
Yeah, and I think just going back to what you explained about Ofer Shelach, that's an interesting point. If you say that a legitimate target was a house belonging to a military operative, then I would assume this house is housed by his wife and his children.
Right.
Who have, again, so the discussion as to whether that's a legitimate target now is on a different level. Obviously, his wife and his children should not be considered legitimate target. And
I wouldn't want to misrepresent the position of the Israeli authorities. No one in, the MAG's office or the army stated those women and children are legitimate targets.
Of course.
However, there's two.
Although, sorry to interrupt you. Although, if you watch analysis of the Israeli operation on international media, in many cases, people will argue that Israel deliberately targeted innocent civilians. Now, going by Ofer Shelach's description, you could make that connection, but I don't think...
absolutely not. I mean, he's very careful to state, and of course this is not something that B'tselem stated.
Yeah.
He was very careful to state that his position is that, or his conclusion is that those people were killed as inadvertently, not deliberately.
Yeah.
One other issue that I think is important to mention in the context of this report is that many of the cases that we investigated and other, journalists, etc., looked into, did not actually involve any kind of official Israeli statement as to what the objective was. I mean, and that's quite important because in previous conflicts, there was more information forthcoming on behalf of the Israeli army spokesperson as to what was exactly the objective of a particular airstrike.
Do you feel you're taken seriously by the Israeli authorities?
That's a very good question. I think there's a whole range of responses that the Israeli authorities have to B'tselem. Some of them are very... I think some of our statements, our work, our approaches to the authorities are taken seriously.
Right.
In other cases, not necessarily agree... they don't always agree with us. They certainly don't always agree with us on our conclusions or our analysis,
interpretations
but in some cases they will accept information that we provide. I think they view us seriously in the sense that they know that we won't just send them any old statement. I think that's primarily with the kind of military's legal people. And I think, of course, on the political level, the more political echelons dispute not only the truthfulness of our report, they dispute the goodwill of our...
your motive.
Kind of, I suppose, maybe I'll put it differently. On a political level, I think, I'd say the majority of the government, certainly the current emerging government, think and have stated very clearly that they completely discount our motivations. They think they're negative. Of course, I dispute that entirely. I think B'tselem is committed to this place of the society, to improving the record of our government. And certainly, I mean, we have very, very serious criticism of Israeli government policy on a whole range of our issues. But this criticism comes from the desire to improve this place.
Why do you not keep it local? If you're trying to improve internally, if you want to get civil rights culture going on in Israel, etc., and improve from within, why not keep it local? Why do you do the dirty laundry for the world to see, as it were?
I think the most important thing is that the situation in the occupied territories is not an internal Israeli matter. It's an international matter in the sense that it's an international conflict. The international community is involved up to its neck in it. The issue isn't just about some sort of internal Israeli question. That's number one. The second issue is that information about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about human rights violations, about our government's actions is made available by our government in all languages. I think that it's important to have B'tselem's information available internationally because that's the correct, truthful, and considered information that actually is much better, in my opinion, than a lot of the material you'll find available on human rights in the territories, on reporting from the territories. And I want this, our verified, truthful analysis to be available. So the first thing we try to do is try to make sure that our reports are written, phrased, published in a way that make them, I wouldn't say immune because I don't think that's possible, but that we do it in a way that combats utilizing them purely for Israel bashing. So, for example, whenever we put stuff online on all of the platforms, we also accompany it with texts. We try to make sure that people read the context, not just one image or one video, but the context. We are very clear about approaching people who misquote or misuse our information. We wouldn't give interviews and wouldn't cooperate with media, requests if we thought that the purpose of the media request wasn't to look at real, out of a real commitment to human rights, but just for
right. So I think, by the way, I before I came here, I didn't know what to expect. I did some research online, and I have to say, after having our conversation, I'm surprised by how sincere and open this conversation was, and I think, I don't know, it might not be your intention to do so, but I think you're playing a great role in Israel's Hasbara without even trying.
I always say, by the way, I always explain, that the funny thing or the paradox is that in some cases, some Israelis, probably many Israelis, are like, they didn't, well, there's no B'tselem in the Palestinian society, there's no B'tselem elsewhere, which is disputable. I mean, there are self-critical organizations throughout the world. But one of the things we say is like, number one, okay, so you're admitting that there is a role for B'tselem, but the other point, in a sense, is that actually the fact that this society has an organization that can be critical of the government and do it, with facing a lot of challenges and attacks, and certainly, a lot of smear attacks and being unpopular. However, we still can operate. I can say what I want. We can say what we think is right. It's a blessing. It's not only a blessing. It's a testament to Israeli democracy, and
True.
In some cases, the Israeli government actually uses that. I mean, the Israeli Foreign Ministry actually made statements in various international forums about the thriving NGO human rights culture that Israel has, which, again, I'm very happy that that's the case.
So they use that to their favor when they need
in some cases, and they
and rightly so.
That's the thing. I mean, I think, and for us, we always clarify that the human rights situation in the occupied territories, that Israel's human rights record isn't the worst in the world. Far from it. That's not the point. The point is that we want our human rights record to be in adherence to our values, not obviously to the values of other governments and countries.
I think that's fair enough. One last question, answer very quickly. Are you proud to be Israeli?
Wow. I think I would like and again, the reason why I'm here at B'tselem and I do this work is because I want to live in a country, I want to live in a society that I'm proud of. I want to live in a society that adheres to my basic values, and that is probably the very basic reason why I'm here and why I work here.
Well, that's a good place to wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
it's been very interesting.
Thanks.